Thank you. And I'll say a little bit more about Lynn shortly when we've done some of the preliminaries. I'm Harry Goldstein of North London Friends of Israel, and we also have the members of our committee here. So what I'm going to do is just give them all an opportunity to say hello now, starting with Angela, who as well as chairing our committee meetings also happens to be my wife.
Hi everybody, welcome.
And now I'm going to introduce our committee members in turn. So firstly we have Leon. Allow me to...
Yes, hello.
Leon, do you want to say hello?
Oh, hello everybody, welcome to the meeting, and thank you very much, Lynn.
Thank you.
Right. And next, Brian, do you want to say a few words? Just a moment. Brian?
You need to unmute.
Hello everyone, thank you very much for coming, and thanks Lynn for being our speaker.
Thank you.
Okay, and Diana, let me just... Diana, you're muted. Just want to unmute yourself and say hello.
Hi, lovely to see everyone, and great to meet you, Lynn.
Thank you.
Looking forward to your talk.
Then we have Sarah. Would you unmute yourself, Sarah, just to say hello?
Yep. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Looking forward to the talk, and thank you, Lynn, for being here.
Thanks, and nice to see you again, Sarah.
And likewise, yeah, thank you.
Right. Thank you. Just a moment. Right, well, thanks very much for that. This afternoon, as well as our North London supporters and the hardworking members of our committee, we are also welcoming people from all over. We are also welcoming people from as far afield as Israel and California, and not to mention Manchester, and all points in between. So thank you all for coming. Now, as many of you know, we normally hold a social event annually at which we have speakers and also socialize over tea and cake. Sadly, this is impossible at the moment for reasons that we're all aware of. So while we can't fully replicate the experience of our usual event, we're hoping to recapture at least a fraction of that social atmosphere. So the meeting will be divided into two parts. Firstly, the formal part, in which we'll hear our speaker, Lynn. Lynn will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open up to questions. You'll appreciate, I'm sure, that with the numbers in attendance, we have to keep everyone except the speakers muted during the event. But please submit your questions at any point during the presentation via the chat facility on Zoom. We'll take as many of those as possible at the end of Lynn's presentation. So you can add your questions on chat at any time during the proceedings. So following the questions, we're proposing to take a short break of maybe 10 minutes or so for you to make a cup of tea or whatever. And after that, anyone who wishes is welcome to come back for a general chat. We know that especially in the current circumstances, basic human contact is so important. Those of you who are familiar with our work will know that our main focus in normal times is on local campaigning. We work in our local area through street stalls, our presence at local festivals, talking to local politicians and so on. Sadly, of course, these are not normal times, and like any other organisation, we find ourselves confined to the online world. We very much hope that better times will return soon and that we'll be able to resume our usual activities. When that happens, we will, as always, need all the support we can get. At the end of the session, we'll be displaying our contact details for those of you who aren't already involved but would like to get involved. And so now to today's topic. We're proud and delighted to welcome Lynn Julius. Lynn will be known to many of you. She's the author of Uprooted, How 2000 Years of Jewish History in the Middle East Vanished Overnight. And she's also the founder of Harif, the Association of Jews from Arab Lands. She's been a tireless campaigner for recognition of what are sometimes called the other refugees, for Israel, and for building alliances with other Middle Eastern minorities. So it's with great pleasure and interest that I hand over to Lynn.
Well, thank you very much, Harry. Thank you, Angela. Thank you to the committee, and thank you to all of you for coming here today to listen to me. I know some of you are familiar with my organisation, Harif, which is the UK Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. It is not solely intended for people from that part of the world. Anyone can join and be on our mailing list. And if you haven't yet subscribed, I do hope you will do, because we're also running a program of Zoom events, and it has opened up a whole new world, actually. So one of the positive aspects of this terrible situation. So to start at the beginning with my book, Uprooted, it came out 2 years ago. I'm glad to say that sales are not bad, pretty good. And it's been translated into Norwegian. And an Arabic translation is underway, and so is one in Portuguese. And I'm hoping that there will be a Hebrew and maybe even a French one in due course. So why did I write this book? Well, first of all, because there isn't that much available for people who want to find out about this subject. There are, of course, academic works. There is Sir Martin Gilbert's excellent In Ishmael's House, which was really the first book to be available in mainstream bookshops on the topic of Jews from the Arab and Muslim world. But most of the work that does exist seems to exist in French, unfortunately. So I thought I would write something that would be accessible to a sort of mainstream readership, and also would bring together what I've learned over the last 15 or so years when I started blogging alongside our Harif activities, which aim to raise awareness of the history and culture of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. I've been keeping a daily blog, which really is called Point of No Return. And basically I surf the net, find interesting articles and put links to them on Point of No Return. And after about 10 years, I found I had about 6,000 posts. You can find this blog if you just Google Point of No Return blog. And some of the articles I've written myself. So at the end of about 10 years, I thought, well, I've got enough material and I've learned so much that perhaps I should put the highlights into a book. And this is really what I've done. And the other reason why I've written this book is, of course, my own family background. My parents were refugees from Iraq, from Baghdad. They arrived in Britain in 1950. And of course, they were, their story really haunted me while I was growing up in the 60s. And we still had relatives in Baghdad. We had my 4 grandparents and various aunts and cousins. And in 1967, as you all know, the Six-Day War broke out, which of course was a fantastic victory for Israel, but it was a catastrophe for the Arab countries. And the regime in Iraq decided to take its revenge on the few thousand Jews still living in Iraq. Now, there was an original community of about 150,000 Jews, but most of these had left. In fact, 90% had left in 1950 to go to Israel. And my parents were amongst the very few Jews who actually came to Britain. But because I had relatives still in Iraq, my parents were really quite frantic about what would happen to my family there. Before long, conditions deteriorated quite dramatically for the Jews still in Baghdad. The government started accusing the Jews of being spies for Israel. They cut off their telephones. They froze their bank accounts. Jews were not allowed to go to university. They were sacked from their jobs. And above all, they couldn't leave. They were actually trapped. In 1969, this was the sort of the low point in what was happening to the Jews in Iraq, and that was the hanging of 9 Jews in Liberation Square in Baghdad, and 500,000 Iraqis came to sing and dance under their corpses. And this was just the start, because about 50 Jews disappeared. They were picked off the streets, jailed, and never seen again. And this was a massive blow to a community that was no bigger than about 3,000 people. So the Jews were so desperate to leave that eventually they managed to escape through the north of Iraq, through Kurdistan, with the help of the Kurds, and of course with Israel's cooperation behind the scenes. My aunt was one of these Jews, smuggled out through Kurdistan and over the border into Iran, which was then, it seems amazing nowadays to say it, but Iran was then friendly to Israel. So that was really another reason why I wrote this book. The main focus is, of course, the 850,000 Jewish refugees from Arab countries. I don't really talk about the refugees from Iran because their exodus took place after 1979 when the Ayatollahs took over, but they are nevertheless refugees, and the community there has dwindled to about 10% of its previous size. So this number, 850,000, is actually greater than the number of Palestinian Arabs who fled Israel, and it's the largest number of non-Muslim refugees until 2003, when there was a mass exodus of Christians from Iraq, and the numbers have continued to dwindle dramatically ever since. So just to give you an idea of the sort of geographical area that we're talking about, we're talking about Jews from about 10 Arab countries, from Morocco in the extreme west, right through to Yemen in the east or the southeast. Now, the Jewish population in Europe actually declined less dramatically than the Jewish population in the Middle East and North Africa, even though there wasn't the same tragic consequences, and most of the Jews did get out of Arab states alive. So you can see this absolutely dramatic decline to the extent that there are only 4,000 Jews out of an original community of almost 1 million in 1948. Only about 4,000 Jews still live in Arab countries today. So this chart gives you an idea of the numbers. You can see communities that had hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of Jews in 1948. Today, you can count them on the fingers of 1 or 2 hands. And in some cases, there are no Jews at all. And actually, we have to update the figure for Iraq because in the last month or so, we lost one of the 5 Jews, an old lady in her 90s. So the other thing you notice is how very old these communities are. They go back to the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century before the Christian era. And that is at least 1,000 years before Islam and the Arab conquest. So those of you who obviously advocate for Israel must come up against this canard that Israel is a European white colonial state. Well, here's your evidence that the Jews not only are native to Palestine, and there's always been a small Jewish community in Palestine through the ages, but a substantial number of Jews have always lived in the Middle East and North Africa, what is now known as the Arab world. And they are effectively the indigenous people of that area. Now, the region I'm talking about has almost as much Jewish history as the land of Israel itself. There are 17 biblical figures who are buried in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Iran, and 5 biblical prophets. And one of those is the prophet Ezekiel. So the prophet Ezekiel has a shrine, or did have a shrine, about 2 hours south of Baghdad. And when there was a Jewish community in Iraq, this shrine was very popular. And about 5,000 pilgrims would come and visit the shrine of Ezekiel around the time of Shavuot, and also between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Now, of course, the prophet Ezekiel goes back to the very beginnings of the Iraqi Jewish community, to the first exile after the destruction of the temple by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BCE. And that community remained in continuous residence in what we now call Iraq for 2,600 years. And they don't even call themselves the Iraqi Jewish community, they call themselves the Babylonian Jewish community. And if ever you have a chance to visit the Or Yehuda Babylonian Jewish Heritage Center, I would very much recommend it. It's a museum about 15 minutes away from Tel Aviv, and it's sort of reconstructed as a typical Jewish house. And there are some very interesting exhibits inside it. Now, I just want to point out, this is what the Shrine of Ezekiel looked like in the 1930s. And on the left, you see the scribes who would write prayers or blessings for the visiting pilgrims. And on the right-hand side, you see a detail from the Hebrew inscriptions that surround the burial chamber of the prophet Ezekiel. Now, look at it today. This is what it looks like today. The picture at the bottom shows you that the shrine has changed beyond recognition. It is no longer a Jewish shrine. It is a massive Shiite mosque. And the original shrine is really a tiny part of this new construction, which actually is quite recent. They only started building it about 5 years ago with Iranian money, I should add. And at first they promised that they wouldn't change the Jewish character of the shrine, and slowly but surely they have been. And the latest news we have is that a synagogue adjoining the burial chamber has, they've now dismantled the Teba, the Bima, the prayer platform, and they've dismantled the ladies' gallery. And again, it is now no longer recognizable as a synagogue. And I think it won't be long now before the Hebrew inscriptions around the tomb of Ezekiel disappear as well. But the main thing is that if a Jew wanted to come and visit this shrine, he wouldn't be allowed in, because this is now a holy Shiite Muslim shrine, and Jews will just not be allowed to visit. And this is sadly what has happened really to Jewish heritage across the region. It has either been transformed or converted to other purposes, or it's been allowed to crumble, so that people will say that Jews never lived in this area. The one exception, I would say, is really in Morocco, and to a lesser extent in Tunisia, where where Jewish sites have actually been restored and preserved. And the King of Morocco has spent an awful lot of money actually preserving Jewish cemeteries, restoring synagogues and Jewish quarters. But of course, a cynic would say he has an ulterior motive. Tourism is extremely important to Morocco. Jewish tourism is very important to Morocco, and it's the second biggest currency earner. So what was the relationship between Jews and Muslims during the 14 centuries that they lived side by side? I think advocates for Israel often come up against this myth that before Israel was established, there was peaceful or harmonious coexistence between Jews and Arabs. But that presupposes a sort of equality in the relationship, which didn't exist, because Jews and Christians were actually dhimmis, and that meant that they were institutionally inferior to the Muslims. Because they hadn't accepted the final revelation of Islam, they had to be continually humiliated and reminded of the fact. They had to wear special clothing. They had to, they couldn't build their synagogues higher than a mosque. They didn't have the same rights in a court of law, and so on. The main thing about being a dhimmi was that you had to pay a special tax, the jizya tax. And in return, the ruler would undertake to protect the dhimmi. In other words, the dhimmis subcontracted their right to self-defense to the ruler of the day. So you might well ask yourself, well, why do they need protecting? And the truth is that trouble did break out against the Jews. There were periodic riots. There were kind of raids into the Jewish quarters in Arab countries, in Arab cities. And the situation of the Jew was really not at all secure. So I will just read you a short passage to illustrate the dhimmi status. In a similar way to their Ashkenazi counterparts in medieval Europe, Jews in Morocco were debarred from certain occupations by the Islamic guilds. As in Europe, they performed certain necessary economic functions, like money lending, and associated tasks, like metalworking, which were deemed reprehensible or unlucky by the non-Jewish majority. The Jews were given the most menial of tasks. One such job assigned to them was the salting of the decapitated heads of executed captives. In Yemen, the job of cleaning the sewers was done by a subcaste of Jews. In Egypt today, the Christian Copts are the rubbish collectors. In 20th century Iraq, Christians also did menial jobs in conformity with their lowly status, like cleaning septic tanks. The small Sephardi community of Palestine was so abased under Muslim rule that a contingent of Ashkenazi followers of the false Messiah Shabbatai Tzvi, seeking refuge in Jerusalem in 1700, refused to put up with the humiliations suffered by the Sephardim. The Arabs behave as proper thugs towards the Jews, one wrote. In Palestine, Jews were not allowed to worship freely at their holy places. The Mamluk rulers forbade them from treading beyond the seventh step on the staircase to the burial place of the patriarchs in Hebron. Nothing equals the misery and suffering of the Jews of Jerusalem, wrote Karl Marx. Turks, Arabs, and Moors are the masters in every respect. To be a dhimmi was to be continually reminded of Islam's supremacy over Judaism and Christianity. Of course, Jews performed an essential function as commercial go-betweens and could and did rise to lofty positions as courtiers, sarrafs, that's treasurers, and merchants. Some were fabulously rich, like Haim Fahi. But like him, these Jews could just as quickly fall into disfavor. Fahi had his nose cut off and his eye gouged out by a treacherous Ottoman governor and was subsequently assassinated. So you see that Jews could prosper, they could become wealthy, things could be very good for them at times. It all depended on the ruler of the day. But the one thing you couldn't be sure of was what the future could bring. And sometimes things were very good and sometimes they were terrible. Jews really had no security and no rights. All this changed quite dramatically in the 19th century. In fact, there was a complete revolution. The European colonial powers began to extend their influence in the Middle East and North Africa, and they insisted on equal rights, primarily for the Christian minority, but that meant the Jews as well. So in 1856, the dhimmi status was abrogated. Now, the Ottoman Empire did not extend throughout the Arab world. In fact, parts of Morocco were not under Ottoman rule, and also parts of Yemen and Iran, or present-day Iran, Persia. So the dhimmi status was still in existence in those countries until the early part of the 20th century. But the Western colonial powers did manage to secure equal rights for the Jewish minorities in these countries. And alongside what was happening with the greater influence of the colonial powers, there was a group of French Jews who decided to set up a network of schools called the Alliance Israélite Universelle, because they wanted to improve the lot of the benighted Jewish communities in the Arab and Muslim world. They wanted to bring education to them, and they wanted to prepare them for the modern world. And they set up, I think in its heyday, there were about 200 schools right across the Middle East, North Africa, and even the Balkans, Turkey, and as far afield as Iran. And this enterprise, the Alliance Israélite Universelle Schools Network, was so successful that the Jews became amongst the most educated in these countries, and a middle class began to emerge. And when the Western powers set up their protectorates and their mandates in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Jews were ready to step in to run the country, basically, to take up important positions in the administration. And they were also prominent in finance and trade and in the arts. And this gives you a little flavor of the prominent Jewish performers who who dominated really the music scene. In Algeria, you see Salim Halali, the Al-Kuwaiti brothers in Iraq. In fact, almost all the musicians in Iraq were Jews, not because they were any better at playing music, but because a Muslim imam had banned Muslims from learning or playing music. And so the Jews stepped into the breach. And in fact, the story is told that one day in the 1940s, the prime minister switched on the radio. It was Yom Kippur, and he heard silence. And he asked his advisors, well, why isn't there any music today? And they said, well, it's Yom Kippur. The musicians don't play on Yom Kippur. And so he got so annoyed that he determined to set up an orchestra composed of Muslims, which would play when he wanted to hear them. There were famous actors, actresses, for instance, the one on the front cover of my book here. Her name is Camelia, that's her stage name, real name Liliane Levy-Cohen. And she starred in about 18 films in the 1940s. Sadly, she was killed in a plane crash, aged only 31. And rumor has it that she was King Farouk's mistress and that he had engineered her death really to get her out of the way. But that, of course, was probably just a conspiracy theory. The other famous Egyptian singer and actress I haven't got here on the screen is Leila Mourad. She was the great diva of the Egyptian film industry, which was like the Hollywood of the Middle East. And even today, people play her music and watch her films. She converted to Islam in the late 40s and early 50s. Salima Murad, another singer, this time from Iraq, and she too decided to stay behind in Iraq after the great exodus of the 1950s, and she too converted to Islam. But all this began to change. In fact, the colonial golden era was really relatively short and only lasted from the end of the 19th century to the 1940s, really. And the reason why it came to an end really was because of anti-Semitism. Now, there was anti-Semitism, colonial anti-Semitism, even though the colonial powers were very happy to exploit the Jews for their skills and their talents and their languages. They were not really prepared to give them equal rights. And the picture on the left shows you a fragment from the front of a pamphlet that was produced by Edouard Drumont. Edouard Drumont was the MP for Algiers. Now, Algeria was actually part of metropolitan France, and the Jews in Algeria had been given French citizenship, but the Muslims had not. However, there was quite a large population of white settlers, ironically called pieds noirs, Blackfeet, who actually resented the Jews because they didn't think they were worthy of having French citizenship. And in fact, there were a few anti-Semitic incidents. There was a great deal of anti-Semitic incitement in Algeria caused by the white settlers. Incidentally, Edouard Drumont led the campaign against Captain Dreyfus, who, as you know, was unfairly accused of betraying France and spying for Germany. I would also point out that the colonial powers were not always prepared to defend the Jews at times of trouble. And as an example of this, there was a massacre in 1941 in Iraq, in which almost 200 Jews died. The British Army happened to be at the gates of Baghdad and could easily have quelled the riot, but they chose not to do so because they didn't want to appear to be interfering in the affairs of an Arab country. And another example of this attitude really is really the great betrayal that occurred during World War II, when the Vichy pro-Nazi governments were set up in North Africa, and they began to strip the Jewish communities of those countries, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia. They began to strip the Jews of their rights. And this was really the first stage on the road to the final solution. But thankfully, the Allies defeated the Germans at the Battle of El Alamein in 1942, and this whole process began to be reversed. There was another type of anti-Semitism that arose at this time, and that was the anti-Semitism associated with Arab nationalism. Now, the Arabs wanted to achieve independence from the colonial powers, but in many cases, this took the form of a blood and soil kind of nationalism, which did not consider anyone who was not Arab or not Muslim really part of the nation. And so minorities like the Jews found themselves kind of excluded from the public space and ushered towards the exit. And this is not just the case for Jews, but other minorities in Arab countries. Several of the Arab nationalist parties were influenced by Nazism. And here you see an example of this is the symbol of the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. You might recognize the emblem there, may remind you of something. And this party actually exists today. And that was pretty anti-Semitic as well. And there were paramilitary youth groups along Nazi lines, and there was a great deal of sympathy with the Nazis. That was secular Arab nationalism. But there was another form of anti-Semitism that arose at this time, there's another form of anti-Semitism that arose at this time, and that was the anti-Semitism associated with Islamism. Now, we hear a lot about Islamism nowadays. Everyone's heard of Islamic State or Daesh, ISIS, ISIL, whatever you want to call it. Everyone's heard of Al-Qaeda and Hamas, which is also an Islamist movement and a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. But in fact, the Muslim Brotherhood was founded in 1928 by the gentleman in the fez on the left, Hassan al-Banna. It was founded in Egypt. And it too was a movement that was influenced by Nazism, although it never acquired the sort of racial connotations of Nazi anti-Semitism. However, anti-Semitism, I would argue, was at the very core of the Muslim Brotherhood's philosophy. The Muslim Brotherhood wanted to re-establish the caliphate that had come to an end with the defeat of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I. It wanted to turn the clock back. It wanted Jews to revert to their dhimmi status under Sharia law. And the Muslim Brotherhood hated the Jews because they represented everything that the Muslim Brotherhood hated most. For instance, the Jews were at the forefront of modernity. The Jews represented civil rights. The Jews represented minority rights, women's rights. The Alliance Israélite Universelle schools were the first to educate Jewish girls. So the Muslim Brotherhood started inciting against the Jews. The Jews were identified with the colonial powers. The Muslim Brotherhood began violent riots. They began arming their people to the extent that a million Muslims were under arms by 1945. And these riots were directed against Jews and Copts and affected Jews in Egypt and Christians in Egypt as early as the 1930s. So it's not true to say that the trouble only started after 1948 with the establishment of Israel. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood's activities were financed by the Germans. And on the right, you see Fritz Grobber, who was the German ambassador to Iraq for much of the 1930s. And Fritz Grobber financed the translation into Arabic of Mein Kampf, and he financed the Muslim Brotherhood and also the activities of Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. There was a three-way alliance, in fact, between the Muslim Brotherhood, Haj Amin al-Husseini, and the Germans. Haj Amin al-Husseini was an anti-Semite before he was an anti-Zionist. And very soon he turned his hostility against Jews who lived in the Arab world, not just in Palestine. So as early as the 1920s, he was inciting violence against Jews in Lebanon, in Yemen, wherever he happened to go, violence followed. And of course, the worst example probably of his activities was what he did in Iraq. He was in exile in Iraq between 1939 and 1941. And there he did not cease to incite antagonism against the local Jews. Eventually, he and a group of pro-Nazis overthrew the pro-British government in April 1941. This government existed for about two months until the British managed to defeat it and put the leaders to flight. So the Mufti then fled Baghdad and ended up in Berlin as a guest of Hitler. And there he remained for the rest of the war, broadcasting vicious anti-Jewish propaganda. Kill the Jews wherever you find them. And here you see him at his famous meeting with Hitler in November 1941. the purpose of this meeting was to ask Hitler's permission for the Mufti to manage the extermination of the Jews, not just in Palestine, but across the Arab world, because he was so convinced that the Nazis would emerge victorious in World War II. So another reason why this was not just a pragmatic alliance between Arabs and Germans to get rid of the British. The Mufti was determined to pursue the extermination of Jews to the very end. And here you can see members of the Muslim SS divisions at prayer. There were units in Bosnia and in Albania who were Muslim, and this was, the Mufti recruited these divisions, and he also played his part wherever he could in furthering the final solution. There is a myth that the Holocaust did not affect Jews in Arab countries. Here you see at the top Tunisian Jews being marched off to labor camps. In fact, Tunisia came under direct Nazi rule in 1942 for 6 months. And at the bottom of your screen, you can see Libyan Jews in a railway carriage returning from Bergen-Belsen. Several hundred Jews of British nationality were actually sent to concentration camps on the European mainland. Thankfully, most of them did survive. There were also some rather nasty concentration camps on Libyan soil. I'm thinking of one southwest of Tripoli called Jado, where 600 Jews out of 2,000 actually died of starvation and typhus. And this story is not really well known, the suffering of the Libyan Jews who were initially under Italian fascist rule and then came under increasing Nazi control after 1942. Another story not well known is the existence of labor camps in Morocco. The inmates were mainly political prisoners, Ashkenazi Jews, Europeans who had been captured and sent to these camps where they were meant to build the Trans-Sahara Railway. And the conditions in these camps could be absolutely terrible, and dozens did die. So one of the big myths one comes across is that anti-Semitism effectively began in 1948 with the establishment of Israel. But here you see a postcard that shows you the aftermath of the pogrom in Fez in Morocco in 1912. This was just one pogrom amongst many that did occur, especially towards the end of the 19th century, which was a time of great turmoil and instability in Morocco. Morocco today has a very good reputation and a reputation for tolerance towards Jews, and Moroccan Jews are really often the first to sing the praises of the Moroccan king and how wonderful he is towards the Jews. But in fact, if you look at the historical record, the Jews in Morocco had one of the worst records for pogroms of all the Arab countries. So fast forward from the end of World War II to 1948, Israel is declared. 7 Arab League countries declare war against it, and at the same time they declare war against their own Jewish citizens. So what they did was they began to pass anti-Jewish laws, restricting Jews, freezing their bank accounts, dispossessing them of their property, and treating them effectively as enemy aliens. So Zionism became a crime in many Arab countries. The problem was, how do you define Zionism? And you had ridiculous situations where Jews wearing watches were accused of sending signals to the Zionists. Was wearing a talit with a Magen David on it, was that Zionism? Was being found in possession of a letter from a relative in Palestine, was that Zionism? And so you had ridiculous situations where Jews were picked up and jailed and tried for being Zionists. And of course, the Jews are absolutely terrified in these countries, because they had, they could be picked up at a moment's notice and accused of spying for Israel. And they really were desperate to leave, but they couldn't because they were hostages to the conflict with Israel. Eventually, pressure built up to such an extent that deals were made with Israel for Israel to rescue many of these Jewish communities. So Jews in Yemen, for instance, were airlifted to Israel. This was the first time anything like this had been attempted. They were rescued in an operation called Operation Magic Carpet, or Wings of Eagles. And there's this lovely story that Yemenite Jews who'd never seen a plane before were told to go aboard the aircraft, and the week's parasha was all about about the Lord sending well, I don't know. It was all about wings of eagles, that the Lord would send eagles to take people to Israel, and therefore the Yemenite Jews got on board the plane with absolutely no fear at all, because they knew that God had told them to do so. In other countries as well, like for instance Iraq, there was a great airlift organized that was called Ezra and Nehemiah. The picture you see on your screen is of an exit visa, laissez-passer.
Hold it up and I've stopped the screen sharing.
Sorry, this is actually a laissez-passer which we picked up in a flea market in Tel Aviv. It belonged to a Jewish accountant from Iraq. And on the left-hand side of the page, you can see a particular stamp which says "one way, no return." So these Jews are effectively expelled from Iraq. And the same thing happened a few years later in Egypt. There was a massive expulsion of 25,000 Jews in Egypt as well. Now, these people were all dispossessed of their property. Their property was seized, their bank accounts and assets were seized. Yeah, sorry, my husband just found the actual quote.
It's in Shemot. It says, you yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself.
Right, so that was the extract from the parasha of the week that persuaded the Yemeni Jews to get on board that plane. Right, so yes, going back to Iraq and Egypt and other countries, these Jews left with nothing. And in fact, in Iraq, a law was passed dispossessing Jews of their property a year after they were stripped of their citizenship. And that was the price they paid for leaving the country. So these Jews actually left with nothing. with one suitcase and maybe 20 pounds in their pockets. Some Egyptian Jews were extremely wealthy. There was a whole class of Jews who actually had grand mansions, beautiful homes, and all these eventually were kicked out and they left everything behind. And here you see an example of the home of the Zuckerman family, now the Swiss embassy in Cairo. And it's astonishing how many embassies today in Egypt were former Jewish homes. For instance, Joseph Nissim's home is now the residence of the Russian ambassador, which is now the site of the modern Russian embassy. Emil Zikov's house is now the Pakistani embassy. Then the South Korean embassy, the German embassy, the Canadian embassy, the Dutch embassy. They were all formerly Jewish homes. And here you see the main square in Cairo. This is taken from an Israeli newspaper. And all the annotations on the right-hand side show you all the Jewish homes that were dotted around Tahrir Square. So what happened to these Jews? Well, the answer is 650,000 out of 850,000 ended up in Israel. Now, Israel at the time only had about 600,000 Jews living there. So it doubled its population virtually overnight. And Israel was then a very poor developing country, and it didn't have the resources, it didn't have the homes, the jobs, or even the food for these newcomers. So it set up tent camps or mabarot. And some of these tent camps endured for a decade or more. And people lived at first in tents, but also in tin huts or asbestos huts or whatever. Nissen huts to start with. And some of these tent camps became cities. For instance, the city of Sderot started life as a ma'abara. Rosh Ha'ayin or Yehuda, they all started life as tent camps, and they slowly developed into proper towns or cities. And life was extremely hard for the refugees. And but yeah, go on. Sorry. This is an example of a wedding invitation. You can see a picture of the bride and groom, and they're inviting their guests to this wedding ceremony and reception in their hut. Please come to hut number 10 in this ma'abara. So the absorption was very, very hard at the very beginning, but after all the difficulties, I think it was successful, and the aliyah of the Jews from Arab and Muslim countries was a success. But their story has been neglected, and it certainly hasn't been taught in schools. And this picture you see is of an artwork by an artist called Meir Gal, and it shows how few pages in an Israeli school textbook were actually devoted to the history and heritage of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. All this has begun to change slowly. The Israeli government has woken up to the need to publicize this story, because after all, more than half the Jews of Israel originate from the Arab or Muslim world. And no peace based on truth really can be achieved unless the claims of these Jews are taken into account in a future peace settlement. We now have a day in the calendar, which is coming up shortly, called the 30th of November, to commemorate the exodus of Jews from Arab countries in Iran. And we would urge as many communities and groups, synagogues, to mark this date. I mean, you don't have to be Sephardi or Mizrahi. This is a Jewish story. We're all one people. This is part of our history, and it needs to be commemorated. So I would just end with this thought, which is that the Middle East is often thought of as the Arab world. I mean, people refer to it as the Arab world, but in fact, it's a rich tapestry of different groups and tribes and religions and sects. And the Jews are just one of these people. And many of these peoples were indigenous or are indigenous to the area. And the Jews are an indigenous people with a right to self-determination. It is not an anomaly to, just to demand a right for self-determination for the Jews. It is perfectly natural. And the Kurds, for instance, have been claiming a right to self-determination for 100 years, but only the Jews have been lucky enough to achieve it. So I would end by saying that the only way to survive really in this inhospitable region is to have your own state and the ability to defend. So I would say that we're very lucky that Israel exists to defend the Jewish people. And on that note, I'll be very happy to take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for that. I wonder if you could just remove screen share. So
Yeah.
that we could,
Okay. How do I remove screen share?
We can't advertise her book then.
Oh dear. Sorry, I have to ask my technical consultant here.
Now?
No, it says resume share.
No, it's paused. It's not showing.
Yeah.
I tell you what, while that's going on,
Oh, there we go.
Thank you. While that's going on, I'm now going to throw it open for questions. But what I will do, I will claim chairman's privilege and make the first contribution myself. Firstly, thank you so much for what a fascinating talk on a really, really important subject. So thanks very much for that.
Pleasure.
I was particularly interested with the ideas, firstly, that anti-Semitism in the Middle East long predates the founding of Israel, but also the fact that some elements of anti-Semitism, I mean, not all elements of anti-Semitism were native to Islam, although some of them are, but some of them were, in fact, as you rightly pointed out, brought by European colonialists. And one fascinating example of that I don't think you mentioned was the Damascus blood libel of 1840, where I don't think most people will be aware, although probably many will have heard of it. It was different from the normal, if I can call it that, blood libels in medieval Europe, where it was the disappearance of a child that sparked the hysteria and the claim that it was the Jews. In what happened in Damascus was that it was actually a Catholic priest and his servant who disappeared under mysterious circumstances. And the first person to suggest that it was the Jews what done it was actually the French consul in Damascus, an aristocratic gentleman by the name of Ratimonton. And from there, it spread initially to the Christian Arab population, and then to the Muslim population. So there's a classic example there of how an anti-Semitic trope spread from what we might call European far-rightists right through to Islam and, if you like, merged with the Muslim prejudices that you also mentioned. Quick question, if I may. You mentioned an organization called the JJAC. Is that a different organization from Harif, and who?
Yeah,
does that?
the JJAC stands for Justice for Jews from Arab Countries. We are kind of members of JJAC. It's an umbrella group that comprises various subgroups. There's another group called Jimena in California, which does much the same thing as we do in the UK. But JJAC, although it was quite active about 10 years ago, especially lobbying in the US, it's really a kind of shadow organization. It's not very active. It did a lot of work at the very beginning in about 10 years ago. But just to go back to your point about the Damascus libel, you're absolutely right. This was a Christian libel. You know, the idea of Jews killing people to you know, to use their blood in matzah and that kind of thing, and killing children for sacrifice. That's very much a Christian idea, which was alien to the Muslim world. But these ideas of Jewish conspiracy and control penetrated the Muslim world under the influence of the Christians. And it was partly to offset this that the Alliance Israélite was set up, because I mean, this was not the only blood libel. It was the first blood libel, the 1840 Damascus libel, but there were about 18 others after that in the Ottoman Empire. So of course the Alliance wanted to protect Jews against this sort of thing. But you're absolutely right. The Christian anti-Semitism is still with us today in the Arab world. These ideas of conspiracy and control that are actually quite alien to the traditional view, Muslim view of the Jew. The traditional Muslim view is that the Jew is not terribly important. He's not a threat. He can be tolerated. He's quite useful, but he is rather annoying because he just won't convert to Islam. But he's
Someone
quite
to be
useful.
despised rather than feared.
Yeah, exactly. Despised rather than hated.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks for that. Actually, just one further point. When we mention the 1840 blood libel, of course, it's worth mentioning that this is 40 years before the start of any Zionist settlement in Palestine, and indeed 20 years before Theodor Herzl was even born. So I think those points are always worth making. Okay, thanks for that. Let's go on to some of the other questions, and this is from Rochelle now, who has said, those who read French like me read Albert Memmi, re North Africa and the Jews. Is this something that you're familiar with?
Yeah,
Okay.
he's fantastic, Albert Memmi. Just to give you a very brief summary, Albert Memmi, who died in May of this year, aged 99, was born in Tunisia into a rather poor Jewish family in the Jewish quarter. He was a very bright fellow. He got a scholarship to the Alliance School, and he subsequently moved to France, where he became a great author and philosopher. And he's one of the few Jews from Arab countries who's managed to really articulate the whole, you know, the whole situation, you know, how they felt towards the Arabs, how they felt towards the French, And he's written some very interesting books. And he also wrote an essay called "Who is an Arab Jew?" which, if anyone wants to read it, it's on my Point of No Return blog, and it actually is an excellent summary of the whole situation.
Thanks for that.
Harry,
Yeah.
may I come in? Would that
Yes,
be all right?
please do. Please do.
Oh, thank you very much. And Lynn, thank you. You mentioned your blog. It's Leon Payne speaking. You mentioned your blog.
Hi.
Do send, I don't know if you put it up on the slide, but do send it to us and we'll let people know about it.
Yes, so it's
That's
a
what
Point of No Return blog. The website address is www.jewishrefugees, all in one word, .blogspot.com.
Jolly good. And we'll put that up on Twitter.
Yeah,
and also.
I'll get it on screen for you.
Thank you. Now, I heard you speak at JW3 a few years ago, and we discussed the Arab-Israel conflict now being a battle for minds and being all about the narrative. So thank you very much for providing so much useful information for that. I wonder, you did just mention it with Harry, but I feel that there's a very long-lasting Muslim view of Jews being inferior. You obviously went into detail about the Jimmy status, and
Yes.
that it may take generations to get rid of that. And I know we've seen what I'd characterize as the revolutionary Abraham Peace Accords, which changes the psychological, well, I think it changes the narrative in the Arab world about Jews. So I'm wondering about your views on that. But I'd just like to make one point and link it to the present. That I think everyone here is probably familiar with Jeremy Corbyn laying a wreath at
Yes.
the grave of the instigators and some of the actual perpetrators of the Munich Olympics in
Yeah.
1972, where some appalling atrocities took place against Israeli Jewish athletes. Now, I just recently discovered, I don't know if it's common knowledge, that the organizer of that massacre, his father actually was trained by the Bosnian SS to continue the final solution after the war. So it's not so much an anti-Zionist atrocity as an anti-Semitic atrocity in Munich.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know if it's politically incorrect to say this, but I think the whole Palestinian campaign is at bottom a genocidal, a genocidal campaign, always has been. And it's only because they haven't been able to achieve it that, people think in terms of, the clash of rights and, it's a question of land and that kind of thing, but I think the Mufti's ideology is very much in the background, and that explains why there are so few Palestinians who talk about compromising. They want everything. They want they're not prepared to compromise in terms of land. They want the right of return, and I think that is the bottom line.
Can I just say,
just another way of saying they want to destroy Israel.
Can I say, Lynn, you are allowed to be politically incorrect here. Can I? but can I go on to, because we have some other questions from people in the audience. And this is thank you, Leon. And this is from Mike Dark, who says, I suspect it's because if Israel uprooted all Arabs from Israel, they would rightly be denounced as racist. So why are these Arab states not being denounced likewise? And then Mike and a number of other people gone on to discuss that in the chat. So I won't go through all of those, but what are your thoughts on that?
A three-letter word, oil.
Yeah. I think that's the main intent of some of the other comments that we've had as well.
I think it's partly because we haven't really made the point about the Jewish refugees. The way the world looks at the Arab-Israeli conflict, they only see one group of victims, and that's the Palestinians. And therefore, they expect Israel to make all the concessions. You know, but I think if more people knew about the Jewish refugees and the fact that the conflict with Israel has to be put in the context of the treatment of minorities in the Middle East, you know, like all minorities have suffered, and even those with no Israel of their own. So that points to a sort of dysfunction in Arab Muslim society. And I think we are basically to blame, we Jews and Israel, for not really making the point and not setting it in historical context. You know, we've really not used our best arguments.
Thanks
We're
for that.
victims of our own success, aren't we? Because we look after our refugees and we turn them into citizens and we spend money on them, whereas the Arabs leave them languishing in refugee camps and use them as a political tool.
Thanks
Absolutely, absolutely right.
Thanks for that, Lynn. Now we've got a question from Stephen Deli in Israel, who asks, is there an equivalent organization like the Claims Conference to work on any kind of compensation for the property lost by these Jews, i.e. the ones from Arab and Muslim countries?
Well, the World Jewish Congress, I think, has been advocating for Jewish claims from Arab countries. And also there is a ministry in the Israeli government that's supposed to be in charge of collecting claims. And at the moment, they've commissioned a study into which will, you know, which will put a figure on how much was lost in Arab countries. They've commissioned an international accountancy firm to do this study, but the results haven't yet been announced. So, you know, it's all a little bit kind of chaotic. You know, there isn't any one particular group, organization that represents Jews from Arab countries. You know, there's a whole number of different groups in Israel, you know, and sometimes there's more than one. I think there's like 5 representing Jews from Egypt, for instance. You know, I mean, they're all supposed to get together under one roof and talk with one voice. It doesn't always happen.
Thanks very much for that. Then I think we've got time for one more short question. So apologies to anyone who didn't get their question in. And this one is just asking, have you ever had any articles on this subject published in the national press?
Good question.
And this is from Diana.
In the good old days, before Seamus Milne took over at The Guardian, I actually had a few comment pieces in The Guardian, would you believe? And I did have a blog at the Huffington Post, but they changed all the rules. So at the moment, my work is really confined to the Jewish press, you know, and Times of Israel, I've got a blog there. JNS News, I've got a blog there. So, you know, we're a little bit limited. Unfortunately, this issue has not penetrated the mainstream media. It's like a brick wall there, you know, no matter how you try, you just cannot get them to really cover this topic. You know, even the Jewish Chronicle, you know, it's very hard to get them to write articles on Jews from Arab countries, except for articles that really, you know, extol interfaith coexistence, this kind of thing. That they're very interested in doing.
Right. I do know that you've made one breakthrough, and after this, I think we'll break from the formal part of the session, but I'm actually going to blow my own trumpet a bit and that of North London Friends of Israel, because I know that you had a very important debate at Westminster Hall, so a parliamentary debate, which was initiated by Theresa Villiers, MP. I don't know if you're aware of the origin of this, because I'm sure you're aware of the ZF Christian Friends of Israel annual lobby days. Well, on the lobby day prior to that, because my MP is Teresa Villiers,
Oh, brilliant.
and I spoke to her, and one of the things I mentioned was the Jews of Arab countries, and I mentioned your book, and she wrote it down. And I thought, oh, well, I don't know if she'll ever get round to reading it or anything. But the next thing I know, a few months later, she'd initiated this debate and got you along to Westminster for it. So delighted with that, and delighted that we made that breakthrough.
Absolutely. Thank you, Harry,
Right.
for your contribution to that.
So on that note, it remains me to thank you so much. What we're going to do in a moment is stop recording, end the formal part of the proceedings, have a break for, say, 10 minutes or so to give everybody the opportunity to make a cup of tea or whatever.
Yeah.
And then anyone who wants to, and of course that includes yourself, very welcome, come back and just have a general chat and try to replicate in some small measure the social atmosphere of our face-to-face gatherings. So but what I'm going to do just for the moment is I'm going to share screen and put up North London Friends of Israel's contact details. So if people want to get involved, want to join, please get in touch with us. You can contact us by email. There's a contact us tab on our website, and you can also see us on social media.
And Harry, before you go, just to say on behalf of everyone else at North London Friends of Israel, and thanks to you and Angela for organising it.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks for having me.
We'll be back in about 10 minutes.